The scanner bed was cold and clean, a sheet of glass reflecting the muted, yellow-white glow of the fluorescent tubes overhead. Elias Thorne placed the geological survey map onto its surface, his fingers noting the frayed, uneven edge of the old paper. He smoothed a corner that had been folded for what looked like half a century. The faint, dry scent of aging pulp and archival ink filled the small, climate-controlled room. He closed the lid, the soft plastic hiss a familiar sound in the profound quiet of the sub-basement. On the monitor, he initiated the pre-scan calibration sequence. A thin bar of white light slid across the glass beneath the map, a silent, methodical pass. His job was a practice in translation. He took the physical past, brittle papers, faded photographs, reels of microfilm, and turned it into immortal data, cross-referenced and searchable. It was a process of imposing order on decay, a fight he could actually win. He watched the progress bar on the screen. 97%. The hum of the server racks in the adjacent room was a constant, low-grade thrum, a sound he no longer noticed unless it stopped. He'd worked here for 12 years, 6 of them alone in this specific section. The quiet had become a part of his own internal landscape. Vast, unchanging, and safe. The calibration finished. A green checkmark appeared. He logged the result in the digital maintenance schedule, his keystrokes quiet and precise. His hands didn't shake anymore. Not here. Here there were protocols. There were checklists. You followed the steps and you arrived at the expected outcome. It was a comfort he couldn't find anywhere else. He leaned back in his worn chair, the vinyl sighing under his weight. His eyes drifted to a smudge on the monitor's casing, a ghost of a fingerprint. He thought of Anya, a thought that arrived without warning, as it always did. Not a memory of her face, but the specific feel of the rough wool of her winter coat under his hand as they stood on a windy overlook years ago. She had been pointing at the valley below, at the concrete skeleton of what would become the Red Creek Dam. "The maps only show you the surface," she'd said, her voice nearly lost to the wind. "The ground truth is always more complicated." He blinked, the memory receding, leaving behind a familiar, dull ache behind his eyes. Ground truth. It was an engineer's term. Anya was an engineer. She had believed in stress tests, material integrity, and the unforgiving laws of physics. She had believed that facts, if gathered correctly, would protect you. The thought was a bitter one now. He looked back at the monitor. The scanned image of the map resolved on the screen, a web of contour lines and faded notations. He began the cataloging process, assigning metadata tags. Region 7, Subsector 4B, Geological Survey, Pre-construction, 1958. Each tag was a small piece of order, a nail hammered into the coffin of chaos. He was good at this. He was good at making sure things were where they were supposed to be, that they could be found again. It was the only promise he could still keep. The system flagged an error, a small red icon, blinking placidly at the bottom of his screen. Cross-reference failed. Source UID not found. He sighed. Not a problem with his scan, but a deeper issue in the database. A ghost. He navigated to the master log for the Red Creek Dam collection, a vast index of everything from core samples to payroll records. He typed in the unique identifier for the survey map and initiated a relational search. The system returned a tree of linked files. He saw the link to the map he'd just scanned. He saw its connection to preliminary site approvals, to budgetary documents, to a folder labeled geotechnical assessments. And next to that folder, another icon, this one indicating a child file that was missing. File ID, GTR 77B, final. Status, destroyed. That wasn't the anomaly. Documents were destroyed all the time, according to strict retention schedules. The anomaly was in the access log. He clicked it open. A simple, sterile list of timestamps and user credentials. The last entry was the destruction order, signed off by a records manager 5 years ago. But below it there was one more line. A login attempt. Timestamp, 2/47. Date, 2 years ago. User, ERR_noth. Access, denied. A failed attempt to access a file that officially no longer existed. It was impossible. A piece of data that shouldn't be there. It was a crack in the perfect, logical world of the archive. A bug. He should just file a ticket with the IT department. Let them purge the ghost entry. It was their job. But he didn't. He stared at the line. 2:47. An ungodly hour. An hour for secrets. He thought of Anya again, of her belief in ground truth. The blinking red icon seemed to mock him. A tiny, insistent pulse in the machine's heart. He felt a tremor in his left hand. A faint vibration he recognized as the prelude to something he'd spent years suppressing. Curiosity. He made a copy of the log file, saved it to a personal, encrypted partition on his local drive, and then closed the window. He looked around the silent room, at the neatly stacked archival boxes, the coiled cables, the sterile white walls. For the first time in a long time, the quiet felt different. It was no longer peaceful. It was withholding. He finished his shift, powered down his terminal, and walked through the silent hallways of the subbasement. The motion-activated lights switched on ahead of him and off behind him, plunging the corridor back into darkness. He felt like he was being followed and then erased. At the security checkpoint, he swiped his badge. The light blinked green. Access granted. He pushed the door open into the stairwell, the heavy metal door closing with a solid, definitive thud. The sound echoed. He paused, his hand on the cold railing. He had a choice. He could go home, eat his silent meal, and forget the ghost in the machine. Or he could try to understand why someone, 2 years ago, in the middle of the night, had tried to access a dead file about a place where his wife had died. He started climbing the stairs, the choice already made. He hadn't been denied access to anything in his own system. Not yet. He spent the next 2 days in a state of controlled obsession, a feeling he remembered from the weeks after Anya's funeral, when he had tried to organize her entire life into labeled boxes. He didn't look at the Ghost Files log again. Instead, he approached the problem from the periphery, using his work as a perfect cover. The Red Creek Dam collection was vast, a sprawling digital ecosystem of interconnected data points. He was a systems calibrator. It was his job to ensure those connections were sound. He started with the supply manifests. The work was tedious, a meticulous comparison of purchase orders, delivery receipts, and inventory logs. He sat in his quiet room, the hum of the servers a steady companion, and followed the flow of materials to the dam site a decade ago. Tons of aggregate, miles of rebar, pallets of wiring. Everything was accounted for, each digital signature matching its physical counterpart. It was a monument to bureaucratic efficiency. Then he found the sealant manifests, a specialized epoxy resin used to seal fissures in the bedrock beneath the dam's foundation. The initial purchase order was for a product from a reputable German company, a name he recognized from other major infrastructure projects. But the delivery receipts were different. They listed a domestic supplier, Geotech Solutions, and a product with a similar sounding but distinct chemical name. There was a change order attached, authorized by the project's managing agency, the Department of the Interior. The reason cited was cost efficiency and supply chain optimization. It seemed plausible. Common, even. He almost moved on but paused. He pulled up the technical specifications for both products. The German epoxy had a 30-year cure integrity rating and was rated for high-pressure, high-saturation environments. The Geotech product was cheaper, rated for 15 years, and had a note in its own documentation. Not recommended for environments with sustained hydrostatic pressure. The foundation of a dam was the definition of sustained hydrostatic pressure. Elias felt a cold stillness spread through his chest. It wasn't proof of anything. Contractors swapped materials all the time. But it was a choice, a deliberate one. He logged the discrepancy in his private file, a growing collection of off-kilter facts. He moved on to the geological reports. The archive held 3 versions of the primary geotechnical assessment for the dam site. The first draft, a raw and lengthy document, detailed significant seismic instability and numerous fissures in the bedrock, recommending extensive and costly reinforcement. The second draft was shorter, its language softened. The warnings about instability were rephrased as potential challenges requiring mitigation, the final, official version. The one linked to all the public-facing and congressional briefing materials was polished and brief. It described the bedrock as largely stable, with minor fissures common to the region's geology. The ground truth had been systematically eroded with each revision. He retraced the digital signatures. The first draft was signed by a team of 3 geologists. The final version was signed only by the lead project manager at the Department of the Interior. The original geologists were no longer listed as contributors. He searched their names in the Federal Employee Database. 2 had retired within a year of the report's final submission. The third had transferred to a remote post in Alaska and left the service 6 months later. It was a clean narrative. No drama, just careers ending and changing. Yet the pattern was unmistakable. A steady, quiet removal of dissenting voices. His hands were steady as he worked the keyboard, but he could feel a tightness in his jaw. He was no longer just a calibrator fixing a bug. He was an archaeologist, brushing away layers of administrative dust to find the shape of something buried. He didn't know what it was, but it had weight. It had intention. He decided to make a careful, formal inquiry. He couldn't ask about geotech solutions or the altered reports. That would be a red flag. He had to stick to the original anomaly, the ghost file. He drafted a formal service ticket to the Department of the Interior's Records Division, the official custodian of the GTR-77B final file. He kept the language sterile, technical. Subject: cross-platform UID synchronization error. Body: during a routine diagnostic of the Red Creek Dam collection, Archive Ref, RC Dam, Call 01. I noted a persistent log anomaly linked to destroyed file GTR-77B, final. An unauthorized access attempt is logged post-destruction. Please advise on protocol for purging this ghost entry to ensure database integrity. Full log attached. He hit send. The request was now in their system. A tiny, official flare sent up into the vast, quiet darkness of another bureaucracy. He had followed protocol. He had asked a simple question about a technical glitch. Now he would wait to see what kind of answer the system sent back. He leaned back, the silence of the room pressing in. He thought of the revised reports, the cheaper sealant. He thought of Anya, standing on that overlook, smiling into the wind, confident in her understanding of the solid ground beneath her feet. The memory was sharp, painful, and for the first time it felt like anger. The reply arrived 2 days later. It wasn't an automated response or a ticket update from a faceless IT drone. It was a direct email from a person. Evelyn Reed, Deputy Director, Office of Archival Governance, Department of the Interior. The name was unfamiliar. The tone of the email was one of cool, final authority. Mr. Thorne, thank you for your query. The anomaly you noted is a known artifact of a legacy server migration from 2018. It is a null data echo and does not represent an actual access attempt. There is no security concern. The entry will be purged during the next scheduled system-wide maintenance. No further action is required on your part. This ticket is now closed. The explanation was smooth, plausible, and utterly dismissive. A null data echo. It was the kind of jargon designed to end a conversation. But Elias knew his own systems. Log entries were not echoes. They were discrete records of an electronic handshake. A request was sent, and a response was given. Denied or granted, the event happened. Her explanation was a lie, polished to a professional sheen. He folded his hands on his desk, staring at her name, Evelyn Reed. He ran a quick search in the cross-agency directory. She had been with the Interior Department for 15 years. He checked her career history. A decade ago, at the time of the dam's construction, she was a junior records liaison. Her name appeared on the routing slips for dozens of the Red Creek project documents, including the final, sanitized version of the geotechnical report. She hadn't signed it, but she had been the one to log it into the system. She was a cog in the machine, a small but essential part of the process that had buried the truth. The next morning, the real pushback began. He tried to access the server that housed the raw data from the dam's construction phase environmental sensors. Information he had reviewed just last week. Access denied. Your credentials do not permit access to this resource. He blinked. He checked the date. It was correct. He hadn't been denied access to an archival resource in 5 years. He tried a different, unrelated database. Access granted. It wasn't a system-wide change. It was specific, targeted. He felt a chill that had nothing to do with the room's regulated temperature. Later that day, his supervisor, Harris, stopped by his workstation. Harris was a man who had weathered 20 years of bureaucracy by becoming formless, taking the shape of whatever container he was poured into. He leaned against the doorframe, a styrofoam cup of coffee in his hand. "Morning, Elias," he said, his voice casual, almost bored. "Just got a memo from upstairs. They're implementing a new security protocol, tightening up cross-departmental access. Something about data sovereignty. So if you find you're locked out of some of the interior stuff, that's why. It's happening to everyone." It was a masterful piece of plausible deniability. It wasn't about him. It was a new policy. But Elias saw the lie in the careful lack of eye contact, in the way Harris's gaze drifted to the buzzing fluorescent light above. Harris knew. Or if he didn't know the specifics, he knew enough to deliver the message. "Stop digging." The conversation was over in less than a minute. Harris ambled off down the silent hallway, leaving Elias alone with the hum of the servers and the clear, unspoken warning. The system was pushing back. It wasn't a fist. It was a slow, inexorable closing of doors. The final piece fell into place that afternoon. He walked to the commissary for his lunch, a sad sandwich in a plastic container. He saw David Chun, a colleague from the microfilm division, the only person he'd spoken to about the ghost file. He had asked David, in passing, if he'd ever seen a null data echo in the logs. David was a gossip but a good technician. He'd been intrigued. Now, as Elias approached his table, David's face became a blank mask. He looked down at his food, suddenly fascinated by his fork. "Hey, David," Elias said, his voice sounding loud in the low murmur of the room. David looked up, his expression unreadable. "Hey, Elias. Can't talk. Got a lot to get through." He gestured vaguely at a stack of papers. A few days ago, they had spent 20 minutes dissecting the merits of a new lens cleaner. Today, he couldn't spare a word. The message was clear. Someone had spoken to David. He had been warned off. Elias felt a profound sense of isolation settle over him. He was no longer just an investigator. He was becoming a liability, a piece of grit in the smooth gears of the machine. He ate his lunch alone, watching the thin, gray light of the courtyard through the thick glass of the window. The people he had worked with for years were now distant, their faces closed. The system didn't need to threaten him. It just needed to make him alone. It needed to cut him off from the information and the human contact that could validate his search. It was a quiet, sterile, and terrifyingly effective form of pressure. He looked at his own hands, resting on the cold Formica tabletop. They were perfectly still. He noted the fact with a kind of detached surprise. The fear was real, but so was something else. A cold, unbending resolve. They had shown their hand. By trying to stop him, they had confirmed there was something to find. He would have to be more careful. He would have to work from the outside. But he would not stop. He would find the ground truth, no matter how deep they had buried it. The quiet of his small apartment became his new archive. The fluorescent hum of the office was replaced by the low buzz of his refrigerator and the distant sigh of traffic on the wet street outside. He had a personal laptop, an older model he rarely used, but its connection to the internet was a portal outside the closed loop of the federal network. Here, his searches wouldn't be logged by Harris or flagged by Evelyn Reed. He felt the shift inside himself, from employee to something else. An adversary. The obsession took on a new texture. At the office, it had been a logical puzzle contained within the neat boundaries of the database. Here, it bled into his life. He stopped buying groceries, eating whatever was left in his pantry. Canned soup, stale crackers. Sleep was a shallow, restless state punctuated by fragments of code and faded images of blueprints. He was haunted not by ghosts but by data. The pressure behind his eyes was constant now, a physical manifestation of his unresolved grief and his mounting frustration. He was chasing a shadow in a labyrinth of his own making, and the line between righteous inquiry and delusion was starting to blur. He pulled out a box from the top of his closet, one he hadn't opened in years. It was labeled Anya Personal Effects. The scent of her, a faint mix of paper and a perfume she rarely wore, rose from the box. It was a scent of irreversible absence. He lifted out a stack of photographs. Anya on their wedding day, her smile wide and unguarded. Anya covered in mud after a charity run. Anya asleep on the sofa, a technical manual open on her chest. He found a photo of her at the Red Creek Dam site, taken a month before she died. She was wearing a hard hat and a bright orange safety vest, squinting into the sun. She looked tired. There were thin, frayed lines of stress around her eyes that he hadn't noticed at the time, or had chosen to ignore. He sat with the photo for a long time, the slick paper cool against his fingertips. He tried to remember their conversations from that period. They had been strained. He had been consumed by a project at work, and she had been distant, preoccupied. He recalled her muttering about shortcuts and unbelievable pressure. He had dismissed it as the usual job stress. "They're rushing it," she had said one night, staring at the television without seeing it. "The schedule is dictating the engineering, not the other way around." He had made a soothing, meaningless comment, something about how it would all be over soon. The memory was now a source of sharp, unbearable guilt. Had she been trying to tell him something? Had he been too absorbed in his own world of quiet order to hear her? This was the precipice of madness, he knew. He was taking the random, painful data of his personal history and trying to map it onto the sparse, circumstantial data of his investigation. He was building a conspiracy to give her death a meaning it might not possess. The official report had been clear. A localized structural failure during a routine inspection, a tragic accident. A section of concrete catwalk had given way. Unforeseeable. An act of God, the lawyers had called it. But the cheaper sealant, the revised reports, the systematic silencing of the geologists, it all pointed to a different story. A story where the failure was not only foreseeable but inevitable. A story where her death was not an accident, but a consequence. He stood up and walked to the window, looking down at the empty street below. The reflection in the fogged mirror of the glass showed a man he barely recognized. His face was pale, his eyes shadowed. Was this what she would have wanted? For him to tear his own life apart chasing ghosts in a dead woman's files? Maybe the system wasn't malevolent. Maybe it was just indifferent, a vast and complex organism protecting itself from disruption. Maybe Evelyn Reed was just a bureaucrat doing her job, and Harris was just a manager trying to avoid trouble. Maybe he was the one who was off-kilter. He felt a wave of profound doubt, a nausea that rose from the pit of his stomach. The entire edifice of his investigation felt like it could collapse into a pile of paranoid delusions. He was alone. The people at his job were avoiding him. The system had locked him out. He had no allies, no one to confirm what he was seeing. He was just a man in a room with a box of old photos and a handful of digital anomalies. He closed his eyes, pressing the heels of his hands against them. The pressure was immense. He saw a flash of color, the bright orange of Anya's safety vest against the gray concrete of the dam. "The ground truth," she had said. The words echoed in the silence of his apartment. He opened his eyes. The doubt hadn't vanished, but it had receded. He had to know. For her. For himself. He had to know if he was crazy, or if he was the only one seeing things clearly. He went back to the laptop and began to formulate a plan. He had to find a way to talk to Evelyn Reed, away from the watchful eyes of the network. He had to make her a real person, not just a name on an email. He had to find a way to make her talk. Finding a way to speak with Evelyn Reed required a different kind of infiltration. He couldn't use official channels. They were closed to him. He couldn't approach her at the Department of the Interior. That would be an immediate security alert. He had to create a neutral context, a problem that only she could solve, forcing a brief in-person interaction. He spent a day studying the interior's public-facing org charts and project archives. He found a record of a data transfer agreement between his agency and hers from 3 years prior, a project to digitize historical land use maps. The project was long dormant, but technically still open, and Evelyn Reed had been the signatory on the interior side. He crafted a new email, this time from his personal account, a carefully worded message of professional courtesy. Ms. Reed, apologies for the direct contact. I am Elias Thorne from the National Archives. I am conducting a final audit of the 2019 Interagency Map Digitization Project, Ref. D-Map 19, and have found a corrupted transfer packet on our end. The original physical file appears to be missing from our manifest. As the signatory, would you have a record of Packet 7A's final disposition? I will be near your building tomorrow afternoon for another appointment and could stop by to resolve this quickly if that is convenient. It was a lie built on a bedrock of truth. There was a project. She was the signatory. The rest was fiction. A plausible bureaucratic nuisance that might just be annoying enough for her to want it cleared off her desk personally. She replied within an hour. Mr. Thorne, I am not in the office tomorrow. I can spare 10 minutes at 15:30 at the coffee shop on the corner of 12th and G, the Federal Plaza Cafe. She had sidestepped his attempt to get inside her building, moving them to a neutral, public space. It was a calculated move, and it told him she was cautious. It also told him she was willing to meet. The hook was set. The Federal Plaza Cafe was a sterile, soulless place. All glass and brushed steel, with uncomfortable chairs and weak coffee. It was designed for transient conversations, a place to meet without committing. Elias arrived early, chose a small table in the corner, and waited. He watched the civil servants come and go, their faces stamped with a familiar mixture of fatigue and purpose. He felt like an interloper, a foreign agent in their world. At precisely 15:30, Evelyn Reed walked in. She was taller than he'd expected, with a severe haircut and a controlled, economical way of moving. She wore a plain gray suit, the uniform of the mid-level apparatchik. Her eyes, magnified slightly by her glasses, scanned the room and found him immediately. There was no warmth in her expression, only appraisal. Mr. Thorne, she said, her voice as clipped and formal as her emails. She did not sit. You have a file query? He motioned to the chair opposite him. Ms. Reed, thank you for meeting me reluctantly. She sat, placing her leather briefcase on the floor beside her. She looked at him, her gaze direct and unreadable. I don't have much time. He decided not to bother with the pretense of the corrupted file packet. Her posture, the tension in her shoulders, told him she knew this wasn't about a 3-year-old data transfer. He would lay his cards on the table, not as an accusation, but as a statement of fact. A technical problem. It's not about the map project, he began, his voice low. It's about Red Creek Dam. File GTR 77B, final. A flicker of something in her eyes. Not surprise. Recognition. It was gone in an instant, replaced by a mask of cold professionalism. I believe I addressed your ticket on that matter, she said, her tone sharp. It's a legacy data artifact. It's not, Elias said quietly. And a week after I asked about it, my access to all related Interior Department files was revoked. A colleague of mine who I spoke to about it was suddenly unable to hold a conversation with me. These are not coincidences. He watched her hands. They were resting on the table, one on top of the other. Her thumb began to stroke the back of her other hand, a small, repetitive motion, a self-soothing gesture. You are making connections where none exist, Mr. Thorne, she said, her voice tight. You work for the archives. Your job is to catalog data, not interpret it. I found the change order for the sealant, he continued, ignoring her warning.
Géotech Solutions.
I read their product specifications. Not rated for sustained hydrostatic pressure. I also read the original geotechnical survey. The one before it was revised twice to erase the warnings about bedrock instability. He wasn't looking at her face anymore, but at her hands. Her thumb had stopped moving. Her knuckles were white. He had presented the data, just as he would in a systems report. Observation. Anomaly. He wasn't accusing her of anything. He was simply stating what the record showed. For a long moment, the only sound between them was the hiss of the espresso machine and the muffled conversation of a nearby table. She stared at him, her expression a battle between professional duty and something else, something buried deep. He could see the internal conflict playing out in the tense line of her jaw. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "What do you want?" "The truth," he said. "My wife was an engineer on that project. She died there." He hadn't planned on telling her that. The words came out, stripped of emotion, a simple fact. But it changed the air between them. Her cold facade fractured. He saw a glimmer of something human, something frayed. Fear or perhaps pity. She looked away, towards the gray street outside. The silence stretched. He thought she was going to get up and leave to end it right there. Instead, she seemed to come to a decision. She looked back at him, her eyes holding a new, bleak clarity. "I can't help you," she said. But then she leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping even lower. "Check the disposal manifests. The ones for hazardous materials from the site prep phase. The contractor was Geotech Solutions. See who signed them. That's all. I don't know anything else. It was a partial truth. A key to a single door in a long, dark hallway. It was more than he had." She stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the tiled floor. She picked up her briefcase. "This conversation never happened, Mr. Thorne. Do not contact me again without another glance." She turned and walked out of the coffee shop, disappearing into the anonymous stream of people on the sidewalk. Elias remained at the table, the echo of her words hanging in the sterile air. He looked down at his own hands. They were trembling. He had his next thread. Check the disposal manifests. She hadn't confessed, but she had pointed the way. She had chosen a side. And now neither of them could go back. The disposal manifests were not in the main Red Creek Dam collection. They were categorized under environmental compliance, a separate and less accessed tributary of the vast river of data. His credentials, though restricted from the core project files, still allowed him access here. It was an oversight. The system, for all its quiet efficiency, was not perfect. It had gaps. He worked from home again, the city lights painting pale, shifting patterns on his apartment walls. The manifests were scanned PDFs, thousands of pages of dry, procedural forms detailing the removal of rock, soil, and chemical waste from the construction site. It was a digital haystack. He was looking for a single signature on a form from over a decade ago, connected to a company that likely no longer existed. He started a search for Geotech Solutions. The name appeared on dozens of documents, all related to the disposal of surplus sealant compound and chemical solvents. He opened the first file, a standard hazardous waste transport manifest. He scrolled to the bottom to the signature block. A cramped, barely legible signature above the typed name. Arthur Finch, Site Foreman, Geotech Solutions. He checked the next manifest and the next. The same signature. Arthur Finch had signed for the removal of every drum of waste connected to the faulty sealant. He was the man on the ground. Elias ran a public records search on Arthur Finch. The man's digital footprint was faint. A few old addresses, a fishing license from 10 years ago. Then a final entry, a death certificate. Arthur Finch had died 2 years after the Red Creek Dam was completed. Cause of death: aggressive, fast-moving pancreatic cancer. He was 48 years old. Elias felt a cold knot tighten in his gut. A man who handled chemical waste for a living dies of a rare cancer. Could be a tragic coincidence. Or it could be a cost of doing business. The crucial link was still missing. Finch worked for Geotech. But who was Geotech? He began to dig into the company itself. Corporate registration records showed Geotech Solutions was incorporated in Delaware 2 months before the dam contract was awarded. It listed a single director and a mailing address that belonged to a corporate services company in Wilmington, a legal fiction, a post office box. The company was officially dissolved 6 months after the dam project was declared complete. a classic shell corporation, created for a single purpose, then erased. This was the wall. The paper trail ended at a ghost company and a dead man. Elias sat back, staring at the screen. He felt the familiar pull of despair, the sense that the system was designed to be impenetrable, to exhaust and defeat anyone who tried to look too closely. He had the pieces, the cheap sealant, the falsified reports, the shell company, the dead foreman. But he couldn't connect them. He couldn't prove that Geotech was anything more than a legitimate, if short-lived, subcontractor. He went back to the manifests, looking for anything he might have missed. He started zooming in on the scanned images, examining the metadata of the PDF files themselves. Most were clean, generated by a standard office scanner. But one file, a manifest from late in the project timeline, was different. Its resolution was lower, the image slightly skewed, as if it had been scanned in a hurry. He opened the file's properties. The metadata was usually stripped by the archival system's intake software, but this one, because of its poor quality, seemed to have been manually uploaded, bypassing the normal process. And there, in the author field, was a string of characters that didn't belong. Lex Chem Corp Legal Scan 04. Lex Chem Corp. He knew the name. Lexicon Chemical Corporation. One of the largest chemical manufacturers in the country. A corporate behemoth with a vast portfolio of industrial compounds and a long, checkered history of environmental litigation. They were not listed anywhere as a contractor or supplier for the Red Creek Dam. They were officially absent from the entire project. But here was their digital fingerprint, a tiny, stray piece of data, accidentally left behind on a scanned form signed by a dead man. The entire picture snapped into focus, stark and ugly. Lexicon had manufactured the cheap, faulty sealant. To shield themselves from liability, they created a disposable shell company, Geotech Solutions, to sell it to the government for the Red Creek project. They knew the product was substandard, that it would fail. But it was profitable. When Anya, a conscientious engineer, must have discovered the material discrepancies and started asking questions, she became a threat to the cover-up. Her accidental death was no accident. It was a silencing. And Arthur Finch, the foreman who knew what he was handling, was a loose end, a man whose eventual death from chemical exposure was likely considered a feature, not a bug. Elias felt a profound and terrifying clarity. He finally had the ground truth. It was a story of corporate greed and bureaucratic complicity that had led directly to his wife's death. He had the manifests, the altered reports, the metadata tag. It was a chain of evidence, fragile and circumstantial, but undeniable to anyone who knew how to read it. He looked at the compiled file on his desktop, a small icon that contained a devastating secret. He now faced a decision. He could take it to the authorities, to the Inspector General. But the system had already shown him how it responds to threats. The evidence would be buried, explained away as a null data echo. He would be discredited, fired, perhaps worse. The official story would remain unchanged. Or he could do something else. He could bypass the system entirely. He could release it himself. There were no guarantees, no assurance of justice, no promise that it would change anything. It would be a single, quiet act of resistance, with no audience and no applause. He took a deep breath, the air in the room feeling thin and cold. He created a new, heavily encrypted folder, dragged all his research into it, and began to compose an email to a recipient who would not be expecting it. He was done asking questions. It was time to provide an answer. The aftermath was silence, a profound, ringing silence that was louder than any alarm. Elias had sent the file. He had compiled his research, the geological report drafts, the sealant specifications, the manifests, the lexicon metadata, and a quiet, factual summary of the timeline, into a single, encrypted package. His cover letter was brief and anonymous, stripped of all emotion. It simply stated, "The enclosed data pertains to structural and material integrity failures at the Red Creek Dam project. The evidence suggests deliberate malfeasance by the contractor Geotech Solutions, a subsidiary of Lexicon Chemical Corporation, with the complicity of officials at the Department of the Interior, resulting in at least one death." He didn't send it to a major newspaper or a television network. A media firestorm would create chaos, but the technical details would be lost in the noise. The system was adept at managing public outrage. Instead, he sent it to two specific places. The first was the Journal of Civil Engineering Ethics, a small, respected publication read by academics and industry professionals, people who would understand the significance of a fraudulent sealant specification. The second was the Independent Commission on Federal Project Oversight, a sleepy but dogged watchdog group known for its methodical, multi-year investigations. He sent the emails from a temporary, untraceable account at a public library computer, then walked away, leaving no trace. He had planted a seed of slow-acting poison in the system's bloodstream. Now he could only wait. He went to work the next day. The fluorescent lights buzzed with the same monotonous hum. The air smelled of old paper and filtered air. He sat at his terminal and logged in. His access was still restricted. He performed his duties, calibrating a new batch of microfilm scanners, his movements precise and automatic. He saw Harris in the hallway. The supervisor gave him a curt, non-committal nod and hurried past. David Chun from Microfilm still avoided his gaze in the commissary. Nothing had changed. The world continued as if he had done nothing at all. A week passed. Then two. The silence stretched, becoming a new kind of pressure. Elias found himself scanning news sites, engineering forums, government press releases, looking for any ripple, any sign that his message had been received. There was nothing. The absolute lack of response began to gnaw at him. Had it been intercepted? Dismissed as the work of a crank? Was the system so monolithic, so insulated, that it could simply absorb a blow like this and not even register the impact? The doubt he had felt before returned, this time with a cynical edge. He had gambled on the integrity of strangers, on the idea that facts, presented clearly, would compel action. Maybe he had been naive. Maybe the system wasn't just complicit. Maybe it was impenetrable. He stopped looking. He accepted the silence. He went to work, did his job with the same quiet competence as always, and went home to his empty apartment. He was living in the aftermath of a battle that no one else knew had been fought. The anger that had fueled him had cooled into a kind of weary resignation. He had done what he could. He had honored Anya's memory not by seeking vengeance, but by revealing the truth, even if only to a handful of people in a quiet corner of the world. It would have to be enough. One Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after he sent the file, Harris appeared at his door again. This time he didn't lean. He stood straight, his hands clasped behind his back, a posture of formal discomfort. "Elias," he said, his voice flat, "can I see you in my office?" Elias followed him down the hall to the small, glass-walled office. Harris closed the door, a gesture that was rare and immediately ominous. He didn't sit down. He stood behind his desk, which was, as always, immaculately clear except for a single manila folder. "I won't beat around the bush," Harris began, his eyes fixed on a point on the wall just over Elias's shoulder. "There's been a restructuring. Some projects are being consolidated. Your current position in sub-basement archival calibration is being phased out." It was another perfect, plausible lie. Restructuring. Phasing out. The sterile language of bureaucratic execution. "I see," Elias said. His own voice sounded distant to him. "However," Harris continued, picking up the folder, "we value your expertise. There's a new opening. Lead technician at the Midwest Regional Repository in Kansas City. It's a great facility. Brand new. They're heading up the digitization of agricultural records. It's a promotion, actually. A pay grade increase." He slid the folder across the desk. It wasn't an offer. It was a sentence. A quiet exile. They weren't firing him. That would create a paper trail, a potential for appeal. They were moving him, sending him to a data backwater, far from the sensitive records of the capital, to a place where his curiosity could do no more harm. They were giving him a choice: accept the gilded cage or be cast out entirely. Elias looked at Harris, a man he had known for over a decade. He saw no malice in the man's face, no triumph, only a tired, blank neutrality. Harris was a functionary, an instrument. He was delivering a message from a source he would never name, about a subject he would never acknowledge. He was a perfect embodiment of the cold system they both served. "I'll need some time to think about it," Elias said. "Of course," Harris replied, relieved. "Take the rest of the day. Let me know by tomorrow." Elias stood up. He did not take the folder. He left it sitting on the polished surface of the desk, a silent refusal. He walked back to his workstation, the hum of the servers seeming to mock him. He had fought the system, and the system, without ever raising its voice, had won. It had not broken him, but it was displacing him, absorbing him, neutralizing him. He sat down in his chair and looked at the blank monitor of his terminal. He had one more decision to make. He did not spend the rest of the day thinking. The decision had already formed, solid and clear, in the moment he left the folder on Harris's desk. He logged into his terminal one last time, not to search for anything, but to erase himself. He navigated to his personal profile in the agency directory and methodically deleted the optional information. His emergency contacts, his list of specialized skills, the biography he had written 12 years ago. He was unwriting his own history within the machine. Then he initiated a system command to permanently wipe the encrypted partition on his local drive, the one that held his private research. The originals were out in the world now. He no longer needed the copies. He watched the progress bar fill, a quiet act of digital arson. When it was finished, he logged out. The screen reverted to the generic login prompt, asking for credentials that he would never use again. He looked around the small, quiet room that had been his sanctuary and his prison for so many years. The neatly coiled cables, the sterile white surfaces, the faint smell of dust and electricity. It all seemed alien to him now, the landscape of a different life. He opened his desk drawer. There were only 2 personal items inside. A smooth, gray stone that Anya had picked up from a riverbed on their honeymoon, its surface worn satiny by the current and by his own thumb over the years, and a small framed photo of her, the one from the dam site, with the tired, knowing look in her eyes. He slipped the stone into his pocket and left the photo on the desk, facing the door, a silent witness. He walked out of the room, not bothering to turn off the light. He passed Harris's office. The door was closed. He continued down the long, silent hallway. The motion sensors tracked his progress, illuminating the path ahead and plunging the path behind into darkness. Felt finally like a release. He wasn't being followed and erased anymore. He was simply leaving. At the main security turnstile for the sub-basement, he paused. He was supposed to swipe his badge to exit. The log would record his departure time. It was the protocol. Instead, he waited. A moment later, a young technician he vaguely recognized came up behind him, swiped his card, and pushed through the gate. Elias held the gate open for a beat longer and slipped through behind him, his own badge still in his pocket. The technician didn't even notice. It was a small, final act of defiance, a refusal to be logged out, to be officially accounted for. He rode the elevator up to the ground floor, the music a tinny, cheerful dirge. He walked across the vast, marble lobby, his soft-soled shoes making no sound. He didn't look at the security guards or the imposing agency seal on the wall. He just walked. He pushed through the heavy glass doors and stepped out into the gray afternoon. The air was damp and cool, carrying the scent of rain and exhaust. It felt real, sharp, and blessedly unordered. The muted sounds of the city, a distant siren, the rumble of a bus, the murmur of pedestrians, washed over him. He walked 2 blocks before stopping at a public trash can. He took the employee badge from his pocket. His own face, younger and more hopeful, stared up at him from the plastic card. Elias Thorne, Systems Calibration Specialist. He looked at it for a long moment, then dropped it into the bin. It landed with a faint clatter on a pile of discarded newspapers. He turned and kept walking, his hands in his pockets, his fingers tracing the smooth, cool surface of the river stone. He didn't know where he was going. He had no job, no plan. He had only the weight of his actions and the profound, terrifying freedom of being disconnected. He did not look back. He was leaving the system behind, a man who had traded his quiet, orderly life for a single, unacknowledged truth. He was alone, but for the first time in years he felt aware. Months later, the name Elias Thorne had been completely absorbed by the past. He was living in a small town in the foothills of a mountain range he'd only ever seen on maps. He rented a small room above a hardware store and worked at a local electronics repair shop. The work was simple, tactile. He fixed broken circuit boards, replaced cracked screens on phones, and resoldered loose connections on old radios. He was good at it. It was a different kind of order, one that resulted in a thing made whole again, a satisfying click as a plastic casing snapped back into place. He lived quietly. He spoke little, but the people in the town were accustomed to reticence. They accepted him as a man without a story, and he was grateful for their lack of curiosity. His grief for Anya had changed. The sharp, obsessive edge was gone, smoothed away like the river stone in his pocket. It was now a part of his landscape, a quiet, constant presence, no longer a wound but a scar. He had not avenged her, but he had honored her. He had chosen her belief in ground truth over the comfortable lies of the system he served. One Thursday, while on his lunch break, he sat on a park bench, reading the regional newspaper he'd bought for $1. He mostly skimmed the local news, town council meetings, high school sports, but he always checked the small print of the business section out of a vestigial habit. And there, buried on page B7, between a report on pork belly futures and an advertisement for a local accounting firm, was a small article. The headline was innocuous. Lexicon Chemical announces new proactive safety initiative. He paused, his hand stilling. He read the short article. It stated that Lexicon Chemical Corporation, as part of a settlement in an unrelated and decades-old class action lawsuit concerning industrial runoff, had voluntarily agreed to fund a new, independent review of safety protocols for materials used in federally funded infrastructure projects. The initiative would focus on long-term material integrity and transparent sourcing. The language was pure corporate public relations, bland and self-congratulatory. The Red Creek Dam was not mentioned. No individuals were named. No wrongdoing was admitted. On the surface, it was a meaningless piece of corporate maneuvering. But Elias read the last paragraph again. The settlement and subsequent initiative were catalyzed in part by an anonymous report submitted to a leading engineering ethics journal earlier this year, which raised significant questions about contractor oversight and material substitution in past federal projects. An anonymous report. He stared at the words, the cheap newsprint rough under his fingertips. There was no victory parade, no public vindication. No one would ever know his name or what he had done. Harris was likely still a supervisor. Evelyn Reed was likely still a deputy director. Lexicon Chemical was still a corporate giant. The system hadn't broken. It hadn't been defeated. It had done what it always does. It had absorbed the threat, processed it, and made a calculated, cost-effective adjustment to ensure its own survival. It had shifted, almost imperceptibly, to protect itself from future liabilities. Elias folded the newspaper neatly and placed it beside him on the bench. He felt no triumph, no elation, just a quiet, profound sense of completion. He had pushed on a wall, and 1,000 miles away, a hairline crack had appeared. A small, almost invisible change had been forced upon a system designed to never change at all. It was not justice, but it was a consequence, an echo. He looked up from the paper, his gaze falling on the uneven pavement of the quiet town square. A child was chasing a pigeon. An old woman was watering the flowers in a window box. The world continued, indifferent to the silent wars fought in sub-basements and the coded language of corporate press releases. He felt the river stone in his pocket, its familiar weight a grounding presence. He stood up, left the newspaper on the bench, and walked back towards the repair shop. There was a television on the counter with a flickering screen, waiting for him. He picked up a small screwdriver. The handle was worn, fitting perfectly in his palm. He went back to work,